A Single Shot. By Rod Rees. September 11, 1777, Brandywine Creek, near Chadsford, Pennsylvania. "That's a frog usser, that is, Captain," whispered Sergeant Hopkins. A cautious Captain Ferguson eased back a branch of the bush he was cowering behind to give himself a better sighting of the two horsemen who were taking such an infernally close interest in the disposition of the British Army. Hopkins was right, the flamboyant uniform of the nearer of the two men was unmistakable. Only French hussars favored so much gold braid. "The other bloke's a Yankee." Ferguson nodded. The blue and buff uniform and tricorn hat were typical of those sported by colonial officers. "Shall we let 'em have it, Captain?" Hopkins asked as he brought his rifle up to his shoulder. "Easy pickings at this distance." That was true. The horsemen were only 50 yards from where Ferguson and his three men were hidden, well within range of their rifles. And they were enemy officers. Something made Ferguson hesitate. In truth, he was sick of how brutish the war in the American colonies had become, disgusted by the atrocities he had seen perpetrated by both sides. He judged himself to be a gentleman, possessed of Christian sensibilities, and Christian gentlemen did not sneak up on their enemies and blast them in ambuscade. Anyway, there was a family tradition of Ferguson's all staunchly Episcopalian sympathizing with rebels. His father had been a resolute supporter of the Jacobite cause. "Hold your fire," Ferguson ordered, and with that he rose to his feet and hallooed the two horsemen. "Gentlemen, I am Captain Patrick Ferguson, officer commanding the Rifle Corps attached to the army of Sir William Howe. I would most respectfully request you to surrender yourselves." The colonial didn't even have the courtesy to acknowledge Ferguson's demand. Instead, he hauled the head of his bay around and made to gallop away. There was a crack of a rifle to Ferguson's left. Hopkins had fired. "Damn your eyes! I said hold your fire," snarled Ferguson as he watched the American stiffen in his saddle and then tumble from his horse to the ground. "Beggin' your pardon, Captain, but he was disobeying your order," answered an unapologetic Hopkins. "Got the bugger anyways, and like the general says, the best sort of reb is a dead reb, what with them all been traitors to the king and such." Biting back a rebuke, Ferguson fired a warning shot over the head of the hussar who had dismounted to tend to his fallen comrade. The hussar, seeing the four British riflemen advancing towards him, decided that discretion was the better part of valor, climbed back on his horse and rode away. When they came up to the fallen man, Ferguson could see that Hopkins's shot had taken the colonial square in the back, and now he lay, dead as mutton, in a puddle of blood. In life he must have been an imposing individual, lean of build and topping 6 feet in height, a man, if Ferguson wasn't mistaken, more used to giving orders than receiving them. Trying to disguise his distaste of such an unnecessary death, Ferguson watched in silence as Hopkins searched the dead man's pockets. The sergeant, not having any letters, handed the packet of papers he found to Ferguson, who quickly scanned them. Then he read them again more carefully, hardly daring to believe what was written there. "It seems, Sergeant," he said finally, "the body we see before us is none other than that of General George Washington, commander of the rebel army." July 4, 1978, Carlton Building, at 5th and Chestnut Streets, Pennsylvania, the United States of New England. Codependence Day Bicentennial Celebrations. Andy Heidel knew the key to successfully executing his mission turned on being able to bluff his way into the office of Rayborough Securities on the 10th floor of the Carlton Building, the office which overlooked Old Parliament Hall, the office where the rifle was hidden. Whilst he had been assured that the false papers he was carrying were nigh on perfect, there were hundreds of EBI agents patrolling the building, and it would take just one unintercepted radio call made to check his bona fides, and the whole masquerade would be revealed. As Heidel approached the building's front door, he fortified himself against the trials to come with the thought that he was doing God's work, that God was watching over him. "Papers," snapped the EBI agent guarding the building's entrance. He had to be EBI given the grey pinstriped, English-style three-piece suit and the bowler hat he was wearing. J. Edgar Hoover, the man who had established the Empire Bureau of Investigation, had been a fervent Anglophile who liked his agents to dress like English gentlemen. Heidel clicked his heels and saluted. Pavel Andreyevich Pronin, he answered as he proffered his faux identity card, inflecting his intonation with a cod Russian accent. Captain in the Okhrana, charged with acting as security liaison with the New England EBI. I have been assigned to surveil the ceremony and be on the lookout for any potential troublemakers and known communist agitators. For emphasis, Heidel patted the binocular case he had slung over his shoulder. The EBI agent gave Heidel the once-over, taking in the Russian cut of his suit and the Puljot watch ticking on his wrist. Hopkins, the mission's mastermind, had been obsessive about the details needed to make Heidel's disguise convincing. Satisfied, the agent turned his attention to the identity card, and from the way his brow furrowed it was obvious he was flummoxed by the Cyrillic script. But then this was the first time the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, had been given permission to operate on American soil. I thought you Ruskies were leaving security in the hands of us Yanks. Change of plan, Heidel answered in what he hoped was a suitably careless manner. The Okhrana has received information that known terrorists are intent on using the bicentennial celebrations to perpetrate a political assassination, and with Grand Duke Gorbachev being in attendance. The EBI agent nodded. Yeah, I guess with Philly awash with bigwigs from all parts of the empire and from the European Commune, it's all hands to the pump. Can't have anything untoward spoiling the festivities, especially as Her Majesty is gracing us with her presence. The agent handed back Heidel's documents. You armed? No, I was advised that police in New England do not bear arms. You were advised right, Captain, no one in the Empire carries a gun. Even so, with this being a maximum security area, I'll have to get clearance from MI5 before I can give you admittance. If you'll bear with me. The EBI agent turned away from Heidel and spoke into his walkie-talkie. This was the moment of maximum danger. If the call wasn't correctly intercepted, then the game would be up. MI5 confirms your clearance is genuine, Captain Pronin, and that I am to provide you with full assistance. Trying desperately to hide the feeling of relief that washed over him, Heidel smiled a reply. Excellent. I'd like to be afforded a position overlooking the ceremony. I thought somewhere on the 10th floor. Once snug in the 10th floor office and with the door locked firmly behind him, Heidel used his binoculars to scan the dignitaries taking their seats on the stage erected in front of the old Parliament building. Prime Minister Gerald Ford glad-handing for all he was worth, milking every morsel of publicity from the bicentennial celebrations. Hardly surprising, Heidel supposed, given the world's press was gathered to cover the event and there was an election scheduled for next year. Ford bowed to the Queen, shook hands with Prime Minister Jimmy Carter, there to represent the Confederation of Southern States, kissed that hateful harridan Prime Minister Thatcher on both cheeks, hugged Grand Duke Mikhail Gorbachev, Tsar Alexander's foreign minister, and then, in what had been billed as the Great Rapprochement, welcomed Erich Honecker, President of the European Commune, to the stand and ushered him to his seat. The press photographers jostled to record this seminal moment, the first official visit a president of the Commune had ever made to the British Empire. Not that Heidel approved of this show of détente. The commies Satan led atheists to a man were the intractable and uncompromising enemies of the God-fearing empire, and hence all of them would be cast into the everlasting fire on the day of judgment. Studying Honecker through his binoculars, Heidel decided he looked every inch the devil worshipper, his thin face and narrow eyes signaling to all good Christians that he was a man without pity or compassion. As such he deserved to die, to be struck down by a bullet fired in the name of the Lord. The bullet Heidel would fire. Honecker took his seat next to Gorbachev, the two of them exchanging smiles and by doing so confirming the rumors that soon the Commune and Holy Russia would join forces in opposing the British Empire. War was coming, the final war between God and Satan. Unfortunately, By the reckoning of the warriors of Christ, the group of fundamentalist Christians Heidel was honored to belong to, it was a war that wasn't coming quickly enough. The sooner Satan was defeated the better, history needing the shove which Heidel would provide. The assassination of Honecker on American soil would be an insult the Commune would be unable to ignore. It would be the spark that would ignite Armageddon. As he pulled the rifle from its hiding place behind the wall panel, Heidel saw Prime Minister Ford walk towards the microphone. Heidel turned on his transistor radio. "Your Majesty, Mayor Rizzo, Reverend clergy, members of Parliament, distinguished guests, lords, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to Philadelphia." Gerald Ford spoke in the elevated, cut-glass, English public school accent Heidel so detested. If his memory served him right, Ford had been educated in Eton and then Oxford, the same path to the top followed by most of those who made up the empire's establishment, the effete, liberal elite who had so readily espoused sinfulness and apostasy and had legalized the deviant activity of homosexuality. They didn't seem to realize that the manifest destiny of the British Empire was to be God's bulwark against Satan. But he and the other warriors of Christ knew it, and they were determined not to stand watching helplessly while the empire's godless, spineless leaders brought the Christian nations of the West floundering to the brink of death. We are especially honored to have Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, with us today, as she is a direct descendant of King George III who, following the defeat and surrender of the rebel forces at Saratoga, displayed the statesmanship and the virtue of Christian forgiveness to know the right time, and the manner of yielding, what is impossible to keep. Saratoga, the battle in which the British had routed Horatio Gates's rebel army and sealed the end of the rebellion, but only just. Heidel agreed with Burgoyne's assessment that it had been a damned close-run thing. Maybe if Washington had been alive, maybe if Benedict Arnold hadn't been ordered to assist Nathaniel Greene after Washington's death and had been there in Saratoga to stiffen Gates's resolve, maybe then the colonials would have won. Unfortunately for the colonials, history was awash with maybes. King George realized that all nations have the right to govern themselves in their own ways, and his magnanimity in victory was the first step in healing the differences which had threatened to tear the English race asunder. Thus the British and the colonials came to work together as brothers, friends, and allies, the five nations making up British North America imbued with the principles of Magna Carta and the Christian faith, this laying the foundation of what would become the mightiest empire the world has ever seen. A trifle sycophantic, decided Heidel, it had been Lord North's conciliation plan, rather than King George's munificence, that had placated the defeated colonials. But then, he supposed, Queen Elizabeth was attending the ceremony, so Ford had to be diplomatic. He began to assemble the rifle, a Russian Dragunov sniper's rifle. Heidel would have preferred to use a good, honest American rifle, but Hopkins had insisted and Heidel had conceded. After all, Hopkins was the one who had so skillfully planned the assassination, the man who had conjured up the false identity papers, the man who was privy to all Honecker's movements, the man sent by God to initiate the cleansing. Sycophantic or no, Ford's rhetoric was rewarded by applause from the Prime Ministers of Canada, the Southern Confederation, Greater Mexico, and California, the nations which, together with New England, formed British North America. That had been the British masterstroke, never to allow the colonies to coalesce into one nation, a nation too big and powerful for even Great Britain to handle. Divide and conquer had been the philosophy followed by Westminster, one carried through with typical English cunning. In 1833, on the birthday of the first Prime Minister of the United States of New England, Benedict Arnold. A cheer from the crowd at the mention of Arnold, the father of the American nations, the great patriot, the man, who, following the defeat at Saratoga, had been charged with making peace with the British. Just a fortnight after, the 6 Southern states had formed a renegade confederacy in protest of the passing of the Slavery Abolition Act in Westminster. Heidel saw Jimmy Carter shuffle awkwardly in his seat. The Second Rebellion of 1833 had led to a bloodbath, with 400,000 killed or wounded before the rebel states were subdued. The one good thing was that as the French and the Spanish had backed the losing side, the Confederacy, and this had given Britain an excuse to take over their possessions in North America. Not that the frogs had been in any position to resist, they were too busy bickering about who should lead the Commune following Bonaparte's death in 1834. Nevertheless, redcoats marching into New Orleans was why the European Commune and the British Empire had been at loggerheads ever since. Prime Minister James Brindley came here to Parliament Hall knowing that he faced the greatest national crisis in our country's 55-year history. "I am filled with deep emotion," he said, "at finding myself standing here in the place where collected together the wisdom, the loyalty, the devotion to principle, from which sprang the institutions under which we live. Today, we can all share these simple, noble sentiments. Like Brindley, I feel both pride and humility, rejoicing and reverence as I stand in the place where 2 centuries ago the United States of New England was conceived in liberty, transatlantic brotherhood, loyalty to the Crown and dedication to the proposition that all men are created equal. From this small but beautiful building, then the most imposing structure in the colonies, came the great document, the Declaration of Codependence, that underpins the moral and intellectual power of all the nations enjoined in the British Empire. It is to celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Codependence that we are met here today." After easing open the window he'd be shooting through, Heidel stepped back into the shadows and fitted the rifle's telescopic sight to the slide rail atop the barrel. He had to be careful not to be seen handling a rifle by the sharpshooters stationed on the roof of the old Parliament building, and this would necessitate him shooting from the very back of the office. To get a sight line of the stage from there he would have to have an elevated firing position. He began to rearrange the office furniture, and as he worked he pondered on the Declaration of Codependence. What this generation of politicians seemed to have forgotten was that whilst the Declaration had settled the modus vivendi of Britain and the colonies, it had also stipulated that the religion of the colonies would be Protestant Christianity. Heidel knew this part of the Declaration by rote. "Whilst the Parliament of the United States of New England shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion, it is acknowledged that the King's most excellent Majesty has supreme authority over all persons in matters ecclesiastical. This power is exercised through the Church of England, a congregation of faithful men in which the pure word of God is preached and the sacraments duly ministered to Christ's ordinance in all things that of necessity are requisite to the same." The pure word of God, not this evolutionary nonsense, not the blasphemy that men could lie with men, not the pornography spewed out by the film studios in Elstree. The empire had to be brought back to God, cleansed in the fire of holy war. The fools leading the Church of England espoused peace between nations. They wanted rain with no thunder, and as the warriors of Christ knew, a church that claims to hold the cause of right, yet condemns confrontation, is little more than a social club. The British Empire had become a realm populated by idolaters, adulterers, homosexuals, thieves, drunkards, drug takers, and wanton women. Heidel gave an exasperated shake of his head. Yes, women were the cause of so many of the empire's woes, women like that termagant, Margaret Thatcher. That the first minister in the empire should be a woman signaled that the empire had turned its back on God. Women had forgotten that the Bible told them to submit to their husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Just as Marina had refused to submit, leaving him for another man. His wife had betrayed him, humiliated him. But he would forgive her. When he had visited Holy Russia back in 1959, he'd not only found a wife, he'd found God, and it would be God who would punish her for her lack of respect. After the cleansing, trying to still his anger at the memory of his wife's lack of respect, Heidel turned his attention back to the radio and Ford's speech. The American settlers faced many, many hardships, but they had more liberty than any other people on earth. That is what they came to America for and what they meant to keep. And though the British government and the colonials differed and warred, less than a year after the rebellion was settled, on the July 4, 1778, they united as brothers. As a symbol of this freedom, before me stands the famous Liberty Bell. It came here over 200 years ago when Philadelphia, after London, was the largest English-speaking city in the world. Inscribed on the bell is the message, "Let freedom ring." This is a message in which all peoples of the empire can join and which I hope will be heard around the world for centuries to come. Heidel snorted. Ford didn't know the true meaning of the word liberty. Liberty didn't flow from parliaments, it flowed from God. Didn't the Bible say that only where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty? Better for Ford to talk about liberating the people from the seductive, corruptive wiles of women, from the lies of science and from the pernicious influence of those who had embraced a life of sin. Of course there were naysayers, those who preferred the bullet to the ballot box, and we still struggle with the consequences of their wrong-headedness. As he set one table on top of another to make his firing platform, Heidel found himself marveling at this piece of understatement. When the so-called War of Independence was lost, its leaders, the cabal of traitors who had gone down in history as the seditious Six, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert R. Livingston and Roger Sherman, had decamped to France in order to avoid the hangman's noose. What they had got up to there still echoed around the world. The failure of their revolution in America had persuaded them that the fault lay in their not having been radical enough in their demands, and the upshot was the spawning of that foul creed of secular humanism that became the creed of the Commune. Those who fought against King Louis XVI during the French Revolution of 1795 didn't just demand liberté, égalité et fraternité, but also the complete remodeling of the economic structure of France, of the world, whereby all the means of production were owned by the people and managed on their behalf by elected communes. Following the success of the French Revolution, this perverse philosophy swept across Europe, helped, of course, by the military successes of that communist extraordinaire, Napoleon Bonaparte, such that, on Bonaparte's death in Paris in 1834, the European Commune stretched from Gibraltar all the way to the border of Holy Russia. The countries of the Commune welded together by one language, one currency, one legal code, one uniform system of weights and measures, and a single-minded belief in the ultimate triumph of the sans-culottes, of the proletariat. There had been great hopes within empire that when Napoleon died the Commune would crumble, and for some years it did, indeed, totter, but then came the man who would reforge and remodel the European Commune such that it would challenge the British Empire for hegemony over the world, President Otto von Bismarck. Heidel loathed Bismarck, Satan's chief lieutenant on earth. Because of Bismarck, the people of continental Europe became finally and fatally enthralled to the perverse, atheistic doctrine of communism, trapped behind what Disraeli called the Iron Curtain. Because of Bismarck, communism had grown until today it threatened to subsume the world. Now only the British Empire stood against this realm of Satan. Backward, introspective Holy Russia was of no real consequence in the world, and it was Heidel's mission to provoke the empire to war against it. Armageddon beckoned. The members of that first parliament met here in 1778 to form a more perfect interdependency of nations, a permanent legal mechanism that would translate the principles and purposes of the conciliation plan into effective self-government for the colonies. The Declaration of Codependence which resulted from this constitutional debate was hailed by William Gladstone, a great British Prime Minister, as the most wonderful work ever struck off by the brain and purpose of man. This notion of corrected wrongs and expanded rights enshrined in the Declaration has brought 2 centuries of a Pax Britannica, the British Empire becoming a beacon of hope for all those struggling to secure their liberty. As Heidel settled himself on his makeshift firing platform, he used the rifle's telescopic sights to focus on Honecker's face and to watch the emotions stimulated by Ford's speech. The smirk told him that Honecker knew the final cataclysmic struggle for the soul of humankind was fast approaching. The thought of world war didn't discomfort Heidel. He was pleased that soon all Christians would have to find the courage to put on the armor of God and stand firm against the forces of the devil. Soon all Christians must be ready to beat their plowshares into swords and their pruning hooks into spears. Soon even the weakest must be ready to say, "I am a warrior." But the struggle for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is never truly won. Each generation of those of us who are citizens of the British Empire must strive to achieve these aspirations anew. Liberty is a living flame to be fed, not dead ashes to be revered, even in a bicentennial year. So it is fitting that, on a glorious day like today, we ask ourselves, are our God-given rights secure, our hard-won liberties protected? Heidel loaded 10 bullets into the magazine of his Dragunov. He doubted that he would need more than one to kill Honecker, but overconfidence smacked of hubris, and pride was a sin. As he pushed the bullets home, he pondered on the question Ford had posed to his audience. It was obvious to him that Americans' hard-won rights were far from secure. His reading of the Bible told him all Christians must flee immorality and abstain from fleshy lusts which wage war against the soul. And in this regard it was the responsibility of women not to lead men into temptation with their female wiles. Women had to shun provocative clothes and makeup, and marry while still young, it being better to marry than to burn with passion. But as Heidel looked around modern America, he saw that women had surrendered to lust and perversion, and were seemingly incapable of practicing temperance and self-control. Women had been duped by the Satan-inspired cult of feminism. Just as Marina had, rejecting his teachings, scorning him as a husband, ridiculing his beliefs, belittling him as a man. Another reason why there had to be a cleansing. The British Empire has always been a defender of liberty. In 1914 the American nations and Britain stood shoulder to shoulder to protect Holy Russia against the illegal and avaricious demands of its enemies. Then Prime Minister William Howard Taft said, "We, the nations of the Empire, were born to freedom and, believing in freedom, are willing to fight to maintain that freedom. We, and all others who believe as deeply as we do, would rather die on our feet than live on our knees." Heidel slammed the magazine home, disgusted that Ford had seen fit to remind his audience of the piece of cowardice that had been the nearly War of 1914. When the European Commune had threatened to invade Russia in support of the Mensheviks who were trying to oust the Tsar, instead of declaring war on the Commune, Taft had listened to that arch-appeaser, David Lloyd George, and opted for peace rather than confrontation. The signing of the British-Russian Common Defense Pact, whereby the British Empire guaranteed military assistance in the event of Russia being attacked, had deterred the Communists, and had given the armies of Satan another 60 years to prepare for Armageddon. Damn Taft to hell. Now though there would be no shrinking back from war. Heidel hauled the walkie-talkie out of his coat pocket, tuned it to the wavelength Hopkins had given him, took a deep breath and then pressed the transmit button. Agent Ferguson in position and ready. Heidel had chosen his code name in honor of that other patriot who had changed history with a single shot. A second's delay and then the walkie-talkie crackled into life. Message received and understood. No action to be taken until you have my command. Just minutes remained. Again Heidel peered through the telescopic sight, zeroing in on the podium. According to the rangefinder he was only 150 yards from the target and hence had no need to make any bullet drop compensation. With the Dragunov having a muzzle velocity of almost 3,000 feet per second, it would take just a blink of an eye for the bullet to strike Honecker. Given the short range, Heidel had decided to go for the luxury and the kill certainty of a headshot. The declaration of codependence is formulated in a common conviction that the source of our blessings is a loving God, in whom we trust. Therefore I ask all members of the Empire and our guests and friends, to join me now in a moment of silent prayer and meditation in gratitude for all we have received and to ask continued safety and happiness for each and every one of us and for all the nations of the British Empire. Thank you and God bless you all. Long live the Queen. Heidel prayed for God to make his shot true. When he opened his eyes he saw Prime Minister Ford raise his hand to acknowledge the applause and the cheers and then turn and gesture President Honecker to the podium. Heidel settled the Dragunov against his shoulder, sighted through the telescopic sight, flicked off the safety and then cocked the rifle. He was ready, his concentration so intense he didn't hear the office door being unlocked and then eased open. Honecker came to stand at the podium, placed his notes carefully in front of him and then gazed out over the hushed and expectant audience. He began speaking in French, the official language of the European Commune, and it took a moment for the radio station's interpreter to get up to speed. I bring you fraternal greetings from the citizens of the European Commune and congratulate you on your 200th birthday. A theatrical pause and then Honecker gave a half smile. My puzzlement is that by my reckoning this is only your 47th birthday. I had understood that the nations comprising British North America were only granted their independence courtesy of the Westminster Act passed by the British Parliament in 1931, before that you were nothing more than colonies. I think it is symbolic of the duplicity of the reactionary, capitalist government based in London that it can dupe a people into believing they are free whilst keeping them firmly under their thumb. It is for this reason the European Commune so strenuously opposes the expansionist tendencies of the British government, a crusade in which we have been joined by Holy Russia. A non-aggression pact will be signed. Execute, came the order from the walkie-talkie. Heidel squeezed the trigger, the rifle's butt jolted back into his shoulder, there was a thud, the sound of the bullet muffled by the silencer, and then he saw Honecker's head explode in a miasma of blood and blasted brain. There would be no need for follow-up shots. Now all he had to do was get out of the building as quickly as possible. He was just levering himself upright when he felt the muzzle of a pistol pressed against the side of his head. Excellent shot, but then I guess being an ex-Marine it's to be expected you'd be handy with the rifle. Hopkins. What are you doing here? And why the gun? You're one of us? You're a warrior of Christ. Not really. My day job's running counterintelligence in MI5. I've been charged with putting a spoke in the commune's wheels and making sure they don't get too pally with the Russians. An ambition you've been remarkably helpful in furthering. With that Hopkins shot Heidel through the head. The brouhaha caused by Honecker's assassination was enormous, but that a British MI5 agent had come within seconds of thwarting the deed went some way towards mollifying the communists, who turned their ire on the perfidious Russians. Which they had every right to do. After all, the official word was the gunman had been a Russki and a card-carrying member of the Okhrana to boot. The speculation was that Captain Pavel Pronin was part of a faction in the Russian court which was less than enamored by the thought of Tsarist Russia climbing into bed with a bunch of communist madmen who for the last 100 years had been plotting to overthrow the Romanovs and install a dictatorship of the proletariat. It got so acrimonious there was even a suggestion that the Commune and Russia might go to war. The non-aggression pact was dead in the water. Of course, there were rumors flying around that this was all a setup by MI5, that a lone gunman couldn't have penetrated EBI security, but these had been dismissed as the ranting of deranged conspiracy theorists. Which, Hopkins decided, was all very satisfactory. To persuade Andy Heidel, one of the more lunatic of the lunatic Christian reconstructionists who populated the Warriors of Christ cult, to do the deed had been a stroke of genius, as had the decision to have him masquerade as an Okhrana agent, Heidel having bought Hopkins' story that this was necessary in order to dupe New England's EBI hook, line, and sinker. Everything had gone exactly as Hopkins had planned, so much so that the word from on high was there might be recognition for his skillful and resolute action in thwarting the attempt of the European Commune to elicit an alliance with Holy Russia, sotto voce recognition, of course, but recognition nevertheless. Which just showed how a single bullet could change a man's career prospects, could change history. In actual history. On September 11, 1777, at Brandywine Creek, Pennsylvania, Captain Patrick Ferguson, the officer commanding a rifle corps attached to the British Army fighting the rebel colonists in the American War of Independence, encountered two horsemen reconnoitering the British deployment. When challenged, the two men rode away, and Ferguson's sensibilities regarding shooting men in the back prevented him ordering his men to fire. One of the men fleeing was General George Washington. If Ferguson had fired, if Washington had been killed that day, the Americans could have lost the War of Independence. there is a strong possibility that command of the colonial army would have passed to Horatio Gates, a man who was to prove himself inept, timid, and decidedly skittish under fire. Gates could have lost the war for the Americans, and as a consequence the speech made by President Gerald Ford to celebrate the bicentennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence would have been radically different. About Rod Rees. Rod Rees came to writing late in life after spending a career roaming the world. En route, Rod has lived in Iran, Qatar, and Russia, and has traveled extensively in Africa and the Middle East. He's built pharmaceutical factories in Bangladesh, set up a satellite telecommunications system in Moscow, and established a successful counter-trade operation in Africa. Rod has spent the last 4 years writing the Demi-Monde series of books, the action set in the counter-intuitive virtual world of the Demi-Monde, the fourth and final installment of which, the Demi-Monde, Fall, was published in August 2013. You can check out the Demi-Monde on www.feedme-monde.com. Rod's latest book, a semi-graphic novel entitled Invent 10N, was published in December 2013, the story following 20-year-old jive-talking, new bop singer and angry young lady, Jennifer, as she struggles against the suffocating strictures of the surveillance society that is the Britain of 2030. Rod lives and writes in Daventry in the UK and worries that one day he will wake up to find that what's happening in the world isn't just a bad dream.